I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This morning, we're considering the rich, wonderful life and creativity of one of this country's most well-loved painters, Margaret Olley. Margaret Olley was born in Lismore, New South Wales in 1923, the firstborn of Joseph Olley, a farmer, and his wife Grace, a nurse. Their family that would eventually include 2 more siblings. Although born in New South Wales, these were tough times. She spent much of her childhood in the family sugarcane plantation in Tully in North Queensland. In 1935, Olley family moved to Brisbane for a time before returning to Tully, but Margaret remained in Brisbane, at considerable sacrifice to her working class family, to board at Somerville House School, just up the road. It was during her time at secondary school that her talent for painting and drawing was noticed by art teacher Caroline Barker, who encouraged Margaret to pursue an arts education. Finishing school in 1941, Margaret commenced classes at the Brisbane Technical College, which she didn't really enjoy, before moving to Sydney in 1943 to enrol in the East Sydney Tech College, which we now call the National Art School, where her boarding school friend and fellow artist Margaret Cilento, that we know well, also attended, and from which Margaret graduated with first-class honours. After graduating, Olley quickly became involved in post-war Sydney art scene. She befriended artists such as Russell Drysdale, Sidney Nolan and William Dobell. In 1948, Olley held her first solo exhibition at the prestigious Macquarie Galleries. This was also the year that William Dobell famously painted his Archibald Prize-winning portrait of Olley, dressed in a gown fashioned from parachute silk, evoking the look of a duchess. The controversy around that painting and her image was so great, she pretty much fled Australia and escaped overseas. When her beloved father died in 1953, Olley returned from travels to Brisbane to live and to paint at her mother's home, Farden, in Maury Street, Hill End, now West End. By this point, the great loss of her father, discouraging reviews of her art, alongside the unwanted attention arising from the Dobell portrait, had taken their toll on Margaret. However, by 1959, she gave up alcohol and her creative output and well-being increased as a result. This time marked the beginning of decades of commercial success, especially with the Johnston Galleries in Brisbane, Macquarie Galleries in Sydney, and sometimes later, Philip Bacon Galleries in Brisbane. By 1962, Olley had left Brisbane and moved back to Sydney and soon purchased her now famous Duxford Street terrace home in Paddington. This is where Margaret lived for the remainder of her life. There she created an atmospheric home and studio filled with artefacts from her travels to New Guinea, Indonesia and many other countries. Reflecting on her bowerbird instincts, Margaret directly put it, "Yes, I am the original bag lady." Duxford and her growing successes gave Olley the independence to continue to paint and travel, and she became a generous supporter to many young artists and benefactor to many numerous public galleries. In the 70s, she shared great happiness with the theatre director and gallery manager Sam Hughes, whom she'd first met in the 40s. His death in 1982, together with that of Olley's mother and the fire at her beloved family home back in Brisbane, where she lost decades' worth of paintings, opened another dark phase in her life. Foregoing the tradition of her husband and family, Olley made art the centre of her life. In 1990, she established the Margaret Olley Trust to acquire paintings for public collections. To the Art Gallery of New South Wales alone, she donated more than $7 million worth in art, including works by Picasso, Cézanne, Bonnard, and many of her own paintings. For both her art and generous and sustained philanthropy across the country, Olley was made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2006. In her final year of her life in 2011, perhaps somewhat amazingly at the age of 88, Olley was once again the subject of an Archibald Prize-winning portrait, this time by close friend Ben Quilty. 2 Archie-winning portraits in the space of 63 years. Extraordinary. Never one to hang up her painting brushes, excuse me, she completed a final body of work for the exhibition at Philip Bacon Galleries just before she sadly passed away on the 26th of July in 2011 in Sydney, in her home. Her death did not end her achievements. As we know, some years later, the contents of Olley's Duxford Street home were moved to Margaret Olley Art Centre at the Tweed Regional Gallery, which opened in 2014, housing some 76,000 objects from her studio and art at Margaret's home, thanks to the generosity of the Olley Trust. Over her long life, Margaret created more than 90 solo exhibitions. And aside from her AC, there are novels, books and exhibitions about her. She received many other awards. Back in 2011, however, Olley told the Australian newspaper painting had always been one of her sustained passions. "It's all I've ever wanted to do," she said. "When the good Lord comes for me, I'll say, 1 minute, I'm not ready. I have to finish this painting." Today, QAGOMA is very proud to be continuing the celebration of Margaret Olley's life, art and massive contribution. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the 2 panel members or guest speakers that we have. The Honourable Dame Quentin Bryce, AD, CVO, is an Australian academic, lawyer and community and human rights advocate who served as the 25th Governor-General in Australia from 2008 and 2014. She was previously Governor of Queensland from 2003 to 2008. Early in her career, Quentin was one of the first women to be admitted to the Queensland Bar, and she has enjoyed a long friendship with Margaret Olley. Please welcome Dame Quentin. Our other VIP is well known to us. Philip Bacon AM is one of Australia's leading art dealers, patrons and philanthropists, and trustee of the Margaret Olley Art Trust. He established Philip Bacon Galleries in Brisbane back in 1974 and is a special patron of QAGOMA and active member of our foundation committee. Philip has been Margaret Olley's art dealer since the 70s. And as of Friday, he was recognised as a Community Philanthropist of the Year in Queensland. Please welcome Philip Bacon. Could I begin, Quentin, with you? Although we know that Olley is a name associated with Sydney, in your essay in the beautiful book which we have promoting straight in front of us, you talk about how important Brisbane was to Margaret. Can you elaborate for us, please?
Look, before I answer that question, I have to say, what a gorgeous morning for us. And many of us have already been through the exhibition, and I feel so deeply emotional about that. And Philip and I were saying often we get tears at the Tweed Gallery, particularly seeing the Yellow Room and remembering Margaret. And I've got an excuse because I think as you get older, you do feel things more deeply. But the beauty of the exhibition, it's no wonder people have been pouring in here since 9 o'clock, the colour. And so it's a lovely, lovely thing to be here.
Well, I think I'm sure many of you have enjoyed or are about to enjoy it.
Brisbane, well, Margaret spoke to me so often of her deep love for Brisbane. We had lots of conversations where we look back, indulging ourselves in nostalgia about this city. Just looking at some of the slides there, of course it is, I think, to a great extent connected to that lushness, the magnificence of nature that surrounded her really from her very earliest days. And the Tweed up at Tully and then here, and that comes through so much of her work. But I think she always felt about Brisbane that she was coming home. And, there are many of us who've heard her comment on that, even driving from the airport with her. It was coming home. And a lot of that, of course, was to do with her mother, whom she loved very deeply, who was her greatest supporter. So I think there are, so many deep attachments from her earliest years. And then, of course, she was here in those very important and influential years in a young woman's life of transition from girlhood to womanhood at Somerville, where she was a very naughty girl. And there are some wonderful stories from there about, one of the teachers who was retired but was still living there, who got around with a parrot on her shoulder who spoke French. And anyway, she of course found that marvellous art teacher, Ms. Caroline Barker.
Yes.
I think you had a few classes with her, didn't you?
Did me no good, but I did. Just on Somerville House, it took decades for me to get her to go back. Somerville was always asking her to come and, be feted as an old girl, but she said they were so awful to me, I'm not going to have anything to do with it. Finally, at the end, a couple of years ago, because of John Honeywell, the artist who's been artist in residence here, convinced her, she and I, to go. And she had a lovely time, and she all was forgiven.
Well, she taught Betty Churcher and many other of our artists.
Caroline
there,
Barker,
didn't she?
absolutely.
Caroline Barker.
And just before we move off Brisbane, Quentin, one of the things that you say is the smell of the flowers in Brisbane and the colour of Brisbane, you think, kind of set the scene for some of her
Oh, yes,
thinking.
and came so much from that idyllic childhood in the Tweed. The wonderful photos from her childhood, those little photos taken with a box brownie of her mother rowing the kids across the river to school, to the Willenbar school, and stuffing the baby brother Ken in the pram, and such universal themes of a childhood of the times. But when you were talking about the tough years, even the times of the Depression, I think that the home life for the children really didn't feel the effects of that at all, because her father was a great gardener, and there were always vegetables and flowers. But as you read some of the wonderful words that have been written about Margaret by people like Meg Stewart and Christine France and Barry Pearce, you can feel the dragonflies in the air, and the magnificent beauty of the landscape and the grasses.
And the smells. She loved those smells, remember?
Yes.
Frangipani and jasmine.
Yes.
She'd come up, for shows with me at that time, and as soon as she got off the plane, she'd say, "Oh, I can smell Brisbane, I'm home." It's exactly what you said.
And she spoke so often of the green, green, green.
Yeah.
Thank you. Philip, you mentioned about being her dealer. Tell us about the very early days when you were kind of wooing Margaret, as it were.
Yeah, I was too, shockingly. She was
nervous, were you?
She was scary. Yeah, of course, she was scary. I first went to her. She was sitting. That Duxford Street house, a lot of you know it from photographs and also from the reconstruction of the Tweed, but it was a big rambly thing, and because she was a very canny businesswoman, and she rented out most of the house. Philippa Drynan, who's a great friend of Olley's and still works for me as a publicist, and who's been very successful in getting the occasional word in the paper about Margaret Olley. Any of you who've seen the press today would know how much there has been. Lived, for instance, in part of the house. But when I saw her first in 72, she was living in what later became the Blue Kitchen, and she was sitting out on the step combing her hair, and the hair was like Rapunzel. It went from there to there. Amazing. She was like a Rubenesque model. I asked if she'd, give me some painting. She said, no, I won't. But come back and see me later. And I did. And finally in 70, I opened my gallery in 74. We had an exhibition in 75. And then off we went.
And
I like the story of when she insisted you paint the walls.
Oh, that was, yes, it's still raw, that. The gallery, I'd only just opened it. It was 9 months old, and I'd spent all the money that I had, or money that I didn't have, on fixing it up and beautiful white walls. And it was the original space where I am now, though, been renovated since. So in she came for her first exhibition. The pictures had arrived early. She'd come up early, a week or two early, because she was staying with her mum at West End, and walked in and the pictures were all hanging. She said, I hate those walls. I can't bear white walls. I said, well, what can we do? We open in a week. And she said, oh, we'll paint them. And she somehow, I think she produced from her handbag, she always travelled with swatches of colour just in case. And so I was sent off down to the hardware store. I said, I can't afford to get painters in. She said, no, we'll do it. And we did that night. Rollers out, rolling. She was a shocking painter. She wouldn't go right up into the edges.
But you can see that translated on the walls of the exhibition.
Yeah, she got the colour that she loved.
The duck egg blue and that wonderful green, especially where the delphiniums are, I think. But the terracotta and
Yes, thank you.
but she loved her hair. She was always twirling it up, and people thought she just put herself together a bit in the mornings. Not at all. She was an artist.
Oh, yeah.
And,
she was her own creation, wasn't she?
And I remember going to see her in some of her very last days when she was in St Vincent's, and her white cotton nightgown, but her long curling hair, yes.
And all the things she had for her hair, those, whatever the girls call those things. She had a huge collection. Some of them are quite valuable.
Hair clips?
That could be it. Well, it was more than that. No, it was more than a hair clip.
Combs
and diamantes and in some case diamonds too.
Wow. So just one of the, going back to staying or being in the early days, she had great success at the Johnston Galleries, which of course we know, I'm sure many of you know, a major gallery, commercial gallery in Brisbane. And, it's amazing to know, just to mark one particular thing. In 1962, she made a record for an Australian woman artist selling £3,000 worth of art in one go. And that £3,000, at that time, £1,000 bought you a new car. Amazing success. And, that success has really something that's gone on and on. And it doubled the record for an Australian female artist at the time. But, you guys were part of that Johnston Gallery scene. It must have been amazing.
Oh, it was, and the fun and excitement of going to the Johnston Gallery. I first saw Margaret's paintings in the Johnston Gallery in the Brisbane Arcade.
Yeah.
I can still recall quite clearly going down those steps with my mother, and there's a wonderful photograph in the catalogue, a big photograph of how that gallery was then, when those straw blinds were a bit of a trend, or you had them if you wanted to cover up things. It was quite a small space. But then the gallery moved to Bowen Hills, which is where we mostly remember it.
Yeah, with the beautiful gardens.
Where there used to be wonderful openings. There were fantastic social occasions in Brisbane. But I don't mean social in terms of the social pages, that sort of thing. I mean, in the true sense of being sociable.
It was called the Salon of Brisbane.
Absolutely, and it had all those lush plants there too, and all the beautiful people would be there. Very many artists. I can see Joy Roggenkamp with her red golden curls, and of course some stunning exhibitions, art we'd never seen before. I remember particularly an exhibition of Blackman, Dawes and Boyd together.
Yes,
that caused enormous controversy. Some of them people thought were a bit rude, some of the Boyds. But I remember particularly, I was really a girl not long out of school, and I remember the elegance and the charm of it all, amongst this lovely Brisbane feeling, the excitement of the art. The artists would be there, and names that are so well known in Brisbane now in our contemporary art history. And I'm thrilled to see Jill Elliott here, because she was one of those beautiful people.
Still is.
And she always wore cream and white. They were really quite enchanting occasions for a girl like me, and very important though for the development of our appreciation and engagement in Australian art, and setting new standards in gallery
display and the catalogues. It was the leading gallery in Australia.
And a lot, well, all of it really due to the way Brian and Marjorie did that. Because he was a new, different sort of director, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. And the space was so beautiful and so, as you say, typical of Brisbane. But somehow the art still triumphed in it because he was so clever. And Marjorie was an amazing decorator as well. So they would do fantastic displays around pictures. And Olley loved that because she hated my white walls, of course. Just going back to my white walls, which then became this pinky colour, she also wanted to bring in furniture from home, from her place, from West End, to anchor pictures and things. And I had friends who bought flowers from their garden. And you remember the big displays we used to have for shows, because Olley thought that was all part of the thing. And that's what Brian and Marjorie did. You know, they were never interested in the white cube. And it worked, and it still works in my view.
And you can see some of that floral idea carried on in our show. I don't know whether we've pulled it off to your high standards, but we've certainly tried to make that.
I think everything's there, I have to say. I thought about the way she would definitely have approved of the table underneath the painting,
she loved that.
All of those things that were on the table that are in the still lives. She was pretty forthright about, what she wanted and talking about why. And she didn't want the painting just there.
Edmund Capon, who has just had his big memorial, who's one of the great gallery directors in Australia, was terrified of Olley. And because she had an opinion, but she voiced it loud, strong and often, particularly about wall colours in the gallery. And I must say, she did influence what the Art Gallery New South Wales, how they treated their walls, and therefore others too, I think. So good on her.
Well, her whole life was about art, wasn't it?
Colour,
We will all be talking about different aspects of her life and enjoying stories. Everybody who's grown up in Brisbane, my generation, has a Margaret Olley story of going to the antique shop or something. But really, for me, what shines through first and foremost is a hard-working artist right to the very last days. And of course, for me, there were many other aspects to her art, but for me, the flowers. And I was at Duxford Street several times when Edmund called in just to give her a wonderful bunch of flowers. And he never seemed scared to me at all. I think.
In her own environment, that was like, in his shop, it was different.
Well, I actually have a question for Philip on that very topic coming up. But just let's talk about, we know that she loved those still lives. But I think the other thing that's wonderful about the exhibition that Michael Hawker has put together for us is looking at those early Brisbane scenes. And there's a brown key tone through them. And there's the beautiful images of the Treasury and the Breakfast Creek. And they're a little bit like a ghost town kind of images. What do you see all these years, looking back at that work? What do you think about those works?
I think, she was always. She was making portraits of those buildings. There's very, very few figures. They're generally front on. She loved the architectural element of it, but more than that, I think she liked the atmosphere of them. She liked old buildings. She didn't like new, and they are like study portraits, I think. really closely observed. She's not interested in the landscape particularly. She's interested in the structure of the buildings and the tone and the atmosphere of them, and that's what she got in her still lifes. That's why, they're not just flower paintings that she did. They are studies in mood and atmosphere, and I think that's why they endure.
Well, and across a long life, and that's the magic of a retrospective like this.
You can see the whole picture.
And tell us, she often talked about Cézanne and Bonnard and Degas, those European master painters. She loved them, didn't she? And you can see Cézanne in her work, but it's not Cézanne, it's her, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. She looked very closely at those great masters, and she had her... Morandi is another one that she loved, and her work could be not less like Morandi, except that she really understood what he was doing with the placement of objects and the space around them, and she did the same thing. It was intuitive with her, or was it? Maybe, she was quite well schooled, and she certainly spent a long life, of looking at great art.
Oh, I think when you read the interview with Barry Pearce in that marvellous book of his, a very long conversation, what shines through is her intellect, her knowledge, her study, whatever else was going on in her life, and there were dramas and tragedies and ups and downs, but it was the art. And she said that's all she ever wanted to be. The rigour of her intellect as an artist.
And it was her life's work, wasn't it?
And that post-impressionist period, it had a very deep influence on her. And I love that time of her life too, when she left to go overseas. There's something truly romantic that reaches into your heart, thinking of this girl from Brisbane who went to East Sydney Tech with her friend. You can feel the adventure and excitement of it and what was ahead of them, and going to Europe on the ship that took weeks. To fall in love with all those painters, but whom she studied very, very carefully.
And that freshness and beauty and that aliveness that you talk about, you see that in her sketches, which are not at all like the masters, but she's actually just trying to get those scenes in those wonderful cities. And again, you see them in the show, and there's a lovely freshness about them, just the way she draws, which I don't think we've really had a chance. We're so used to her paintings, we don't really. There's a chance in the show to really look at her drawing abilities, which are serious. Seriously
well, she never went anywhere without a sketchbook in the early days,
including on the back of capstan.
Anything. She'd draw and write on anything.
Paper,
that was her
cigarettes.
Shorthand, really. She never had a camera. That's not true. She did have a camera, but only for people in her own house. You'd go there for dinner, do you remember? And out would come the camera, and there'd be hundreds of photographs taken, which are all archived, which is fantastic because they're really a history of the world. But when she was away abroad, she would have her sketchbook and get it down.
She spoke of how she loved beginning a painting, starting it.
Perhaps not so much the end.
No, well, she was never satisfied, and I think it drove you nuts.
Nuts, crazy, insane.
Always a little more, and she would have them around that room, and working and working.
We'll
on
talk
them.
later about that last weekend, but that was a case in point.
Well, just before we leave her kind of production, I think there's one quote that James Gleeson said about her quite a long time ago that was so clever, and he said, "There's nothing scrimped, cramped, lean, or undernourished or impoverished in her pictures. They inevitably give you an impression of such fullness and abundance that you are reminded of a harvest festival." It's a girl from the bush.
Well, I think the title, the generosity, just shines through her life from the very beginning. I mean, the family, there was a generosity there when you read of the early childhood years at Farndon, the loading of the table, her mother's extraordinary hospitality, and her own that. It could be a bit challenging sometimes. She got older and frailer and couldn't quite see all
Washing
the
up
dust.
didn't become a priority, did it?
I think it's revealing that when Quentin and Michael came over, what turned out to be the last weekend that we were all together before Margaret died, and Quentin had said, "I'll come over to Admiralty House and we'll have lunch." And she said, "I can't come, darling. I'm painting, but you can come to me and I'll get you lunch." So they arrived. Michael weighed down with the driver with picnic baskets full of everything, including plates and cutlery, just in case something untoward happened. I think it was probably the dining room table was always set, well, always full of stuff, junk and things that she was painting and condiments and things, and also a handy packet of ratsack, just in case.
But she did love to entertain, and there was a generosity that shrouded that always, that came from her mother. I mean, Farndon was a place that, like Duxford Street, people called in, the Southerners, her friends, the artists. They called in on their way to the north and for the winter, and even further north, as that became the idea too, to travel in Southeast Asia particularly. But you feel the generosity.
I want to change track a bit and move on to Margaret as a muse. Now, Quentin, you've been the subject for a few portrait paintings. Margaret was, of course, the subject for William Dobell's very famous Dressed Up Margaret, that drew a lot of attention, and a lot of it for her quite unwanted. We have, thanks to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, who was incredibly generous to this exhibition, we have Dobell's famous portrait here. You know what it's like to have the focus of attention on you. What was it like for poor old Margaret back in 1948?
Well, look, I just have to say how thrilled I am to see that portrait and to be able to stand close to it, seeing the sparkle and the twinkle on that hat. And I love that portrait. And I was standing there with a woman about my age. We were just standing there, and I said, "I love this portrait." And she said, we were out loving each other about it. And it just is one of the great portraits, and the stories about the parachute
dress,
silk,
yeah,
etc. I'm so thrilled that it's here. But that was a pretty torrid time for her. She was a shy young woman. You know, she belongs to a generation when we were girls. We were brought up to be seen and not heard, and not to talk about yourself. You know, your mother or your sister give you a dig and say, "Stop showing off," if you talk too much. And she was essentially shy, and you can feel that through her. At those times, and there was enormous attention on it because the press was trying to whip up controversy related to the Joshua Bell portrait. I think it was just the year before.
Yeah, a couple of years before.
And I think you used the term she fled Sydney. Well, she set off for Europe, and I mean, talk about the press. They've always been the same, I suppose. When she got to Ceylon, they were there. And she felt...
hunted.
She did, yes. The word we use now, I suppose, is harassed by it. I think it was a pretty torrid time for her.
And whilst we might say that Margaret has had an enormous amount of success, and we've just talked about that time when Dobell's picture gave her quite a lot of unwanted press. There has been some quite tough times in her life. In fact, my words here are no bed of roses, but I don't think she painted roses, did she? There were some key tragedies. You mentioned the fire at her home in Farndon, in Brisbane, unexpected loss of David Strawn and Sam Hughes. Look, they left their marks on Margaret, didn't they?
Yes, yeah. She went through a very dark period. I mean, she was prone to depression anyway, but after that, in the mid-'80s, and you can see it in her pictures too. Those mid-'80s pictures are really dark, even if they're not painted at night, because, and I could always tell that she was not too well, apart from the book. I spoke to her nearly every day on the phone, but and you remember, Philippa, that flat voice that she'd get when she was depressed. But even if you weren't talking to her, as soon as you walked to the house and saw what she was working on. Dark, sort of sombre colours and really low keys. It really was. But she kept working. That's the thing that saved her. She says that, you know, if she wasn't working, then there was no point to it all.
But she bore her grief quietly too.
Yeah.
And when she went to David Strawn's house to paint from there.
Oh yes, that was a beautiful period.
And the Tweed had that beautiful exhibition of Strawn and Olley paintings together, and there was someone who commented on his David Strawn's strong influence, but that was a very deep friendship of artists.
Yeah, it was a close friendship, and I think a bit, in a way, say her influence by Suzanne's influence over her was a little bit like the Strawn thing. I mean, you can tell them they're different, but they are related, and they're looking at each other. And I mean, Strawn was obviously a lot more cerebral, I think, in his life, and you know, his pictures are sort of Freudian analysis almost, and Olley's aren't that, but the way that she used objects, and of course because she was painting in David Strawn's house after he died, she used a lot of his objects. In fact, she took a lot of his objects. Some of the favourite, like there's a beautiful vase that's in a lot of the pictures, or jug rather, the white with blue jug with a handle like that. That actually was David Strawn's, and long time after David died, when the estate was being settled, which I was handling, his sister Ronnie said, "I want that jug back." This is, 20 years later. She didn't get it back.
Well, that was my own name, Strawn. I've always tried to find some connection with it.
I'm sure it's there.
But I think in that exhibition where their paintings were together at the Tweed,
very interesting, wasn't it?
Yes, very interesting.
Did you think they were? Could you tell? You could tell them apart, though.
Yes, but there was one saw a very powerful connection. So, that's the magic of curating.
Yeah, there's an interesting story about that. When Margaret was painting, she never finished anything, much to my horror. And when she was in Strawn's house, which was a house in Paddington Street, just around the corner from her place, and a similar terrace house, and it had a veranda out the front. So Olley was there for years painting, and she'd start things and not finish them, always bored. So the paintings that were not finished went out on the little balcony thing. And some years later, so they were Margaret Olley's, some years later they started turning up in auctions and things with a D. Strawn signature added to them. Wow. Somebody had nicked them, and because it was David Strawn's house, they assumed, they're David Strawn pictures, and carefully applied a D. Strawn signature.
That's a movie, isn't it?
It's a fantastic story. I've got to be a bit careful because it's,
But she painted also from Barry Humphrey's apartment.
Oh yes, but
beautiful
she was
views of the harbour.
Yeah, once she got into somebody's place, she never wanted to leave.
A bit like the lady in the van.
Very much.
In London.
Very much.
So, but Philip, you've already mentioned this about her being very direct and quite formidable, and you're right. I was at the Edmund Capon's memorial, the art gallery director of New South Wales for 30 years, incredibly close friend of Margaret, and together they bought some extraordinary works of art, including the Cézanne, which we have on display, again, thanks to their generosity. And in those speeches, Tim Storia, the famous Australian artist, actually said, despite their friendship, Edmund did live in fear of Margaret Olley. And my question is, could that be possible, Philip?
Yeah, of course.
Did you live in fear?
Not towards the end, no. But she was formidable.
But sometimes you think she preferred a fight to a feast,
Yes.
And she was always trying to get me to talk politics.
Well, she herself said that she was right of Genghis Khan.
I won't comment. And I'd say, I'm not going to answer that. I think she liked that cut and thrust. She thrived on it, and real conversation went on around the table because she would provoke it. But I remember saying one day, Philip, get some very precious painting she had tucked away.
Was it the Picasso, maybe?
Yes. Get that. And up came this Picasso from behind a couch, and I was feeling so nervous about it. I mean, you never knew what was going to happen next, and I think that she was the person who really prepared for conversation too, the things that she wanted to talk about when she had particular people gathered.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, no, she had a game plan. If she'd have... she'd get, John Howard when he was Prime Minister. I was watching them. Howard was opening something at the art gallery, I think, or somewhere. John, and she's sort of chasing him with her on a walking frame. And of course he stopped and talked to her, and she wanted to tell him about the importance of regional art galleries. She always had a cause that she was...
Well, that's something she and I talked about a lot because... and she was so generous in a very strategic way, the regional galleries. And Newcastle probably being the best known of them, but, when you think about our wonderful regional galleries in Queensland, and that went back to her childhood. Everything
absolutely,
begins there.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
And we talked about her being strategic. She was an incredible businesswoman, wasn't she? Pretty much from get-go.
Well, that started at Newcastle too, as I understand. She was there. There was an exhibition of her work, and she walked down a street, as the story goes, looking at houses, and she bought one, and that was the beginning of it.
Yeah, she thought they were very cheap.
And she built up a portfolio of real estate, and that has benefited so many artists and art in our country, putting together enormous sums of money that...
But of course, in those days, the reason artists did that, if they were able to, was because they didn't think they were going to sell a picture. I mean, Jeffrey Smart told me that whenever they'd sell a painting, any of that group, it was a time for celebration. It wasn't usual. It was unexpected, and and they couldn't depend on an income from art. So those who were able to, like Jeffrey, I mean, he bought a house in Sydney in the early days, and that became sort of the beginning of his financial success, really, because they needed... Justin O'Brien did the same thing. They really felt that they needed a backstop. There was no Australia Council, no funding from governments.
Despite your, the reference to the record sum of the £3,000, she went through some bare times too, Margaret.
Oh, yeah, sure.
No, she was about being successful and taking off forever, as you say.
No.
And you didn't know what might be round the corner.
No, it was always a surprise to her. Even, right towards the end, she wasn't. And she was never really that interested in the sales either. She used to, particularly in the early days, the first show that I had, the highest price was $900, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, $900. And we've got one of the pictures from that show in a show that's coming up at my place, and it's $120,000 now, exactly the same picture, which is more than...
That's a very good little ad for the day.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to say that. Is it...
Dear Philip,
can I give you the address? But she used to say she kind of knew that they were cheap even then. $900. It was what they were. But she said, "Oh, I sell frames and I give away the paintings for free."
I forgot to mention when we were talking about generosity and her development of young artists. It's been so significant. I love the story of the generosity towards her from Anne Weinhold, who, when Margaret applied for the travelling scholarship when she was at art school in Sydney, she just missed out on it. and Anne Weinhold, who was a sculptor, she won it, and she set off, and that was going to set Margaret back a long way. And it was just a couple of years later that Anne Weinhold sent her, I think it was £2,000 to travel to Europe, and then many years later, Anne Weinhold, who wasn't so well known, had a major exhibition, and Margaret went to that and bought the most significant piece in it. And I love those stories. And
she never forgot a favour,
No.
and she replicated it 100 times over.
Well, let's talk about that. Obviously we're putting the show together with Ben Quilty. That exhibition doesn't open for another 2 weeks because it's started off in the Art Gallery of South Australia. So together, when those two exhibitions open, it will be an extraordinary discussion between two generations of Australian painters who are close friends. But she would often buy and support artists in shows. So Cressida Campbell, Harding,
Lots.
but
many more.
Yeah, and that was going back to that idea of helping out because others had helped her out.
Yeah.
And once again, strategic. She would go to the exhibition, buy a painting, give it to a gallery, and she said to me, of course they wouldn't dare not hang it if I didn't. And so this emerging artist will be hung in a major gallery.
Yeah.
And off they went.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in the days when I was at the National Portrait Gallery, there was Margaret Olley mentioned to me that there was a portrait of David Strawn that had been given to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and she wanted it to come to Canberra. And that would mean that the Art Gallery of New South Wales would have to de-accession this work to give it to another institution. Unheard of. And I was just listening to this thought going, if anyone in Australia could make this happen, it's Margaret Olley, and it's exactly what happened.
Well, what I want to happen is for the Art Gallery of New South Wales to give the Ben Quilty portrait to the Tweed.
Oh, well...
What do you think?
The Ben Quilty portrait actually belongs to Ben Quilty still. So
I've spoken to him about
Oh, I bet you have. I'm sure he said, we'll see. Did he?
Well, I think Ben's statement is he wants it back because it's been sitting in the Art Gallery of New South Wales forever.
Didn't that capture the imagination? I mean, that's just one of the things that's in all our minds, I'm sure, the way she was so universally loved. I don't remember anybody, and most especially an artist of any genre, being so acclaimed at the time of her death. And
I know, it was
all
amazing.
the stories of, when you're talking about her Willy Walker, she used that as a weapon, I think.
Of course.
She was always
really
first in the queue and give you a bit of a shove.
It was called
And
Moses.
didn't she get a bell on?
It was separating the...
Didn't she get a bell on it?
Yeah, she had a Chanel ribbon, so it couldn't be mistaken for anybody else's, and a bell.
So again, I'm moving into the concluding part. But when the Ben Quilty show comes, we'll put the great portrait into the Margaret Olley show, and of course we have a whole exhibition of Ben's work. And Ben, in the middle of those two, has done these enormous sketches that goes back to that portrait, and has actually made. And the way he's drawn it is actually by making pots that she had given him, ceramics and vessels, and moulding them into chalk, and using the chalk into drawing onto the wall, and then dropping them in a kind of an Ai Weiwei moment, even though he didn't get the reference to Ai Weiwei apparently, and he said, "Oh, I never thought about that."
I just had a glimpse this morning on the screen out there of Ben Quilty talking about Margaret, and especially I just saw a couple of minutes of his speaking of her last paintings. It was very touching. I'm looking forward to really seeing that.
And, so both of you would go to, you saw a lot of Margaret, and then she died, literally paintbrush in hand, pretty much. She just so-called finished works for you, Philip. It must have been incredibly moving.
Yeah, I still can't really talk about it much. It's been written about a lot, but Quentin was there and Michael the day before. Yeah, it was, but it was also irritating because I had this show coming up in a few. She said, "I need a deadline, darling. You give me a deadline." I used to work in the theatre, so I'd tell her, but I'd always tell her, a week earlier than I actually needed things. And then she woke up to that, so it was still at the last minute. So the Bryces were over, and then she was still working, but she was supposed to be signing pictures. So I went out to say goodbye to them, leaving her inside to sign these pictures because we had the framer coming, do you remember? And then the photographer, particularly they had to be signed before the photographer came. So when I went back in, 5 minutes later, brand new board up, nothing on it, and she's just sort of doing. I said, "What are you doing? You can't start another picture." "Oh, I just sort of caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye." Drove me crazy.
Well, I have to say, this is the first time I've managed to talk about Margaret without having tears on my cheeks, and I don't easily fall into that state. But it is a life that provokes that. I think her contribution to art and beauty in our country has reached out to all Australians in a unique way.
I think so, and I think it'll last. I know, there's always a question about an artist, even a famous artist, will their work survive the times? And I'm personally convinced that Olley will. Whatever she's saying, she says differently to anybody else, and it's universal, her truth, I think, and people want to see it. Look at this, I mean, it's amazing.
Well, a great way to finish. I was going to ask you about, all through art history, people have been saying, painting's dead. And, here we have two great examples of two Australian artists who you can see their love of paint just writ large. And two very different artists, for Ben, who wouldn't be someone who would say that I'm a painter of universal truth or beauty, and yet such a great combination of people and great love between those two. I think it's just a terrific way of putting those two shows together, and frankly, I can't wait to open the Ben Quilty show so that we can have that movement between the two exhibitions. Yeah. I would like, if you've got any finishing remarks, hang on to them. I wonder if there's some questions that we might take one or two, and then if, with people's indulgence, I thought I might read a little ode to Olley by Barry Humphries. That's a yes? Well, has anyone got some questions, please? We've got a microphone wandering around. And while perhaps if somebody can, Philip, just finish perhaps on that legacy. What do you see in that 10 years' time? What will they say about Margaret? What they say now? Something new, do you think?
I don't think there'll be anything particularly new. Just I think there can't, because the Tweed exists and, her lifestyle was so much a part of her life that will always be something that people will understand what it is. There's very few house museums in the world that really work, and the Tweed is one of them. I was in the Morandi House Museum, which is actually closed, but they've transferred it to the Bologna Museum, and it was full. The rest of the museum, which is huge, was empty. The Morandi House Museum was full because people love to see how magic is made, I think. And with Olley, you get a glimpse behind the scenes, and behind the scene was as important as what she was doing front of house. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people will always get. New generations will continue, I think.
Because the stories are passed down, and there's so many stories, a long life.
Yeah.
Well, and Australia has so few surviving studios.
Yes.
5 maybe. Yeah. A question there, thank you.
This is a question for Philip. You mentioned that Margaret Olley planted herself in Barry Humphries' apartment to paint the harbour, and I saw a show about that, and she said she'd never really painted the whole harbour, and she really wanted to do it. And it was the most beautiful triptych. And I have asked at the Tweed Gallery and said, where is this beautiful painting, triptych of this?
Next door.
It's here.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, how wonderful.
It belongs to the New England Regional Art Gallery, NERAM, in Armidale, and they very kindly lent it to this show. So you'll hop in next door, you'll see it, and it's hung with... Oh, no, wait a minute. Sorry. No. I beg your pardon. I was thinking of the yellow rim too. You're thinking of the big... we sold that to a private collector. It's in Melbourne. He is considering giving it to a museum. Funny enough, he's a Hollywood producer, this fellow, Australian Hollywood producer. But he bought it for his flat in Melbourne. Yeah, the big... But there are other harbour pictures.
There's the triptych in there. So
yeah, but that's the yellow room. The lady's asking about the harbour.
Yes, that's a lovely wall on the white weatherboard.
She was warned about painting the harbour by everybody, including me, for it not to be cliched. It's such a iconic thing. How can you paint the harbour and the bridge without it becoming a cliche? But she managed it, didn't she? And that picture that you saw, it's a beauty.
It is enormous, isn't it?
Thank you. Any other questions? Very good. You're very well behaved. You probably want to see the show. Well, look, if I read the ode, perhaps before I do that, could we please thank both Dame Quentin, Bryce and Philip Baker? So an ode to Olley was first recited by Barry Humphries in the Artist's Presence on the 28th of September in 2005. For this major exhibition and for our catalogue, Barry has revised the verses. Ever the performer, Barry has given the following strict instructions when giving it publicly. He suggests it is spoken aloud, slowly and distinctly, to a large, intoxicated and inattentive group of art lovers. The vocabulary has been simplified for an Australian audience. I clearly think he's thinking of a Sydney audience. So here goes. Ode to Olley 2019. Few artists lay such claim to our attention or have a public so adoring. Unlike some national treasures I could mention, Margaret, in contrast, was never boring. Today we celebrate her life in art. To overlook her genius would be folly. How, you might wonder, can one even start to sing the praises of Miss Margaret Olley? A crowded tabletop, a pomegranate, a vase of cornflowers, a spray of lilies. In case you've lost your bearings on the planet, Miss Olley provides a glimpse of Double Bay. The rugs, the jugs, congealing cups of tea, colours which evoke Bonnard and Matisse evoke. The Chinese screens and objects we see behind the veil of Margaret's ciggy smoke. This was her studio, her home, her bower, distilled on canvas by her hand and brain. And we are witness to that witching hour when Wickham Terrace morphs into Duxford Lane. Hitherto, Australian art had but one creed. One great pictorial fixed idea had gripped us. How many ways to paint that wooden weed, that bogan of all trees, the eucalyptus? With pigments brushed and stippled, smeared and flicked by master painters or the merest plodder, our artists have all struggled to depict our vast khaki expanse of koala fodder. Against the grain, against the trend and fashion, with works of quiet joy, serene and deep, Miss Olley has pursued her private passion, disdaining piles of rock and pickled sheep. Confronted by Cy Twombly or Damien Hirst, beneath some dignified museum's dome, I've heard the floodgates of decorum burst when Olley exclaims, "Darling, no one home." No installations these, there's nothing funny about Miss Olley's painted poetry. Just an array of work worth twice the money, appealing to all men of tastes like me. She had the spirit of the truly great. Her faith in life and art was never shaken. And if she ever paused to contemplate, she leant on her walking frame or Philip Bacon. Loyal to her friends, including me and Lizzie, she offered us her art, her heart, her skill. Now Margaret Olley has come back to Brizzy, a still life painter who was never still. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, my co-presenters. Thank you for everyone.